Today I'm going to touch upon a number of issues which I personally think is a big challenge. One of the big challenges, there are many challenges, but one of the big challenges in not only in Indonesia but in a number of Asian countries. But I'm not talking about the most debated issues today's exchange rate, monetary policy, fiscal policy. No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about more sort of medium and long-term challenge for Asia and Indonesia in particular, and that is about productivity. A number of reasons why I picked this topic. When I learned that today's lecture that will be delivered by Professor Roscarno is about boom, about sort of resource boom, immediately I thought this must have something to do with the export composition, export diversification, because when you follow the history of Indonesian economy since way back in 1970s, that was really the episode of the Indonesian economy, moving from oil dependent to non-oil dependent and so forth. And all kinds of discussion has been sort of conducted, including the discussions about the repercussions on economic policy, the Dutch disease and so forth. But that has something to do with to what extent the country is able to diversify its economy, to diversify its export and so forth. This chart is a distressing chart because it really shows that Indonesia failed to diversify. If you look at the trend of the diversification index, which is the thick line, the thick curve there, that represents Indonesia. The other curve represents other Asian countries. I didn't even put the name of the countries there. But it clearly shows that the country fails to diversify. Now, that has something to do with the competitiveness, of course. And you can use any measures to identify the trend of the competitiveness in the country, as well as you can pick practical examples. So one of the practical examples, next please. This is just showing you how unusual is the trend in export in Indonesia, because in the normal patterns of development, usually the share of the primary sector has been declining, but in Indonesia it did so only up to 1998, but since then the share of the primary export has been increasing. And that is closely linked to the topic that Ross is going to discuss later on, because of the dependence on the primary sector's coal, palm oil and so forth. Next. This is a practical example. If we look at the competitiveness of Indonesia, and I'm taking this case comparing Vietnam and Indonesia in the case of electronic components. As we know, one of the robust trade performance in Asia has been featured by a strong production network, the supply chain and so forth, in which the measures of trade is no longer just based on comparative advantage that leads to the intra-industry trade. What I mean is the extra-industry trade, but it's more on the intra-industry trade. The meaning is that you no longer classify the export or import of countries based on whether it is manufacturing or primary sectors and so forth. So the feature of the production network in Asia has been countries exporting manufacturing products, but at the same time also importing manufacturing products, because this is components. So the manufacturing product that has been imported is the components, and then the process, and then they become different types of manufacturing sector, and then they export the manufacturing sector. So that is the nature of the production network here. Now, this is an example shows that in the past, Indonesia has been doing better than Vietnam in production network, especially in the electronic components in this particular example. But in late years, Vietnam has surpassed Indonesia. So this has something to do with the competitiveness of the country. It cannot be otherwise, because Vietnam is one of the ASEAN countries with a number of similar features like Indonesia. But if they can surpass Indonesia in terms of competitiveness, in this particular example, it's only electronics. And by the way, this is only one of many examples. I have a number of examples by commodities and so on. That is a source of worry. And that leads to the discussions about productivity. Because when we talk about competitiveness, basically we are talking about efficiency, and one measure of the efficiency is productivity. That is the reasons why I'm picking up this topic. Next. This is the worrying trend of the productivity in Asia. Now, if we look at the growth of the per capita in GDP, per capita income in Asia, many of us know that what happened after the 1997, there was a sharp drop in the growth, and then the region recovered. But then after the 2008 global financial crisis, the growth of the per capita GDP declined. Now, it is also not surprising, next please, that that cycle is mimicked almost one-to-one by what happened with the growth of the productivity, whether you measure by labor productivity or by total factor productivity. This is the trend. Now, of course, the question here, $6 million question is this a cyclical or structural? Well, unfortunately, no economist can give you good and definite answers, because economists are very bad in making predictions. They are only good in explaining after what happens. But we can make some speculation, not predictions really, speculation. My personal speculation is this is going to be very difficult and very long, for a number of reasons. Let me just make one argument why this declining trend or the decelerations of the growth of the productivity is going to take longer than in the past. Because if you look at after 1997 crisis, the economy recovered, even measured by the productivity, not only by per capita income GDP, but, per capita income growth, but also by the growth of productivity. One of the most important reasons is really what happened with the global economy. We should not forget that after the year of 2000, the world economy is doing very well. Now, we know now that the world economy is sick. And this is my speculation. I think this sort of unhealthy global economy condition will last longer than in the past. That means it is not really good news in terms of external factors that can contribute to Indonesian productivity performance. So again, I'm not making any prediction, it's just making speculation, and my speculation is that this is really worrying trend. Next. If you look at the trend of the TFP, this is the TFP. As I mentioned earlier, after the fall in 1997, after the Asian financial crisis, many countries recovered, including Indonesia. But look at the pace of the recovery. The latest year data of the TFP in Indonesia is even lower than the pre-1997 level. Okay. Now, it shows you that things are getting more difficult to recover, because one can make an easy argument that, well, after you fall, especially if the fall is very sharp, you can easily recover. But not this time, I think. Next. This is the growth rate. So earlier I showed you the level, but this is the growth rate. Again, whether you measure by labor productivity or total factor productivity, the growth has been declining. Next. There is a little bit mumbo-jumbo mathematics decomposing the productivity, but it's forget about the mumbo-jumbo, but basically the essence is that you can decompose productivity into two parts. One is what they call the structural part, and the other is the within part. What's the difference between the two? Structural, the within is basically improvement of productivity in particular industry, particular sector. But what is the point of improvement of productivity in one sector if it doesn't diffuse to the rest of the economy? So that is the case of non-economy-wide productivity improvement. That is the within. That is the green color. The second part is called the structural. So when the productivity is spreading throughout the rest of the economy, that means the structural component has been dominating. And this is the trend of the productivity. not only over time but also by these two decomposed components, the structural and the within. As you can see here, basically both the structural and the within portion has been declining. Next. Now, one relatively easy way to look at what happened with the productivity. Think about two scenarios. One scenario is that only few sectors improve its productivity, but as I said, it doesn't spread out to the rest of the economy. Another scenario is that the productivity improvement is taking place in a sector that grows fast, vis-a-vis improvement productivity in a particular sector, but that sector is growing slow. So of course the ideal situation is you want the economy in which the fastest growing sectors are those that has also high growth of productivity, which means what you want is really positive slope in this particular chart. And comparing Latin America, Africa, and Asia, indeed Asia has been doing very well. In the case of Asia, I'm taking the example of Thailand and India during the period of 1990 to 2005. Next. And this is the overall Asia, not just India and Thailand, but the overall Asia. You can see the curve started to show slightly negative slope, right? Let's look at Indonesia. Next. Negative slope, slightly negative slope. What does it mean? It means the sectors that is growing fast in Indonesia are those sectors that does not perform high growth of productivity. You can pick any examples. My favorite example is the services sector. You know, when I studied economics 35, 40 years ago, the so-called normal patterns of development is you move from primary sector to manufacturing to the services sector. There was an implicit assumption behind that kind of a theory that because when you move from primary manufacturing to services, you're improving your productivity, implying that the services sectors are the sectors that contain high productive activities. That may be true for many industrial countries, because most of the services sectors in industrial countries are IT related, IT intensive, and so forth, but not in developing countries. The bulk of the services sector in many developing countries, including Indonesia, is informal sectors with low productivity. In other words, it is dangerous to simply look at the share of the value added over time from primary manufacturing to services without looking at what happened with productivity. What is the point of developing services sector if that sector contains a lot of non-productive activities like informal sectors? So in other words, we have to be a little bit careful in looking at the so-called normal patterns of development that we studied in the 60s and the 70s. One of the fastest growing sector in the Indonesian economy is the services, retail. In fact, many examples you can sort of gather that these days, many so-called business people prefer to trade rather than to produce, rather than to manufacture, for many reasons, because of the regulation, taxations, land acquisitions, labors, and so forth. Whereas if you are importing stuff, especially if you're importing from relatively low-cost products, like from China, for example, and then you sell those products that you imported, your margin is big enough, rather than you making a production. So that contributes to the growth of the retail sector. But that retail sectors, not to mention the informal sectors that I indicated earlier, has relatively low productivity. That is the reasons why the slope for Indonesia is negative. Next. The same thing. Let me pass that. Same story. Next. The last point I want to mention, because I'm sure you will hear more about this, more complete as well as with explanations what happened in particular sectors, i.e. mining sectors from Ross. It's in a few minutes will make his presentations. So let me just mention two other things here before closing. One is which sectors to develop. Now, of course, different sectors have different capacity for productivity. But based on a study using global data done by Danny Roderick at Harvard, he shows that basically, if you look at labor productivity trend, there is no convergence. This is the chart. You don't see any convergence, because if you see convergence, the sort of average curve will show a negative slope, meaning that the low productive countries will grow faster than the high productive countries. Definitely this doesn't show that. And then he goes by sectors, not only in 1 digit, but 2 digit, 3 digit, and so forth. Many of them show similar pattern, except one, and that is manufacturing sector. Next. So I don't show the other many sectors, I pick only the manufacturing sectors. Yes, there is a convergence in productivity. Now, of course, this is a study based on more than 100 countries around the world. So what does it mean for my sort of hypothesis related to Asia and Indonesia in particular? Well, if you look at the source of productivity, this study, to me, gives some indication that manufacturing is the potentially, of course I have to underline the word potentially, is the potentially sectors that has the capacity for productivity improvement. In other words, of course, I'm going to make an extreme and exaggerated statement now. If you go to manufacturing, you cannot go wrong. This is exaggerated, of course, because even within the manufacturing sector, there's all kinds of activities, including non-productive manufacturing sector. But overall, global data shows that manufacturing is the source of productivity. What happened in Indonesia? If you look at the share of the manufacturing sector, again, following the so-called normal pattern of development, you should move from primary manufacturing to the services. Next. Next. The green line is the manufacturing sector share in Indonesia. In late years, it has been declining. So, I'm not saying that this is the explanation for the declining share, declining growth or the decelerations of the productivity in Indonesia. But definitely, this is one of the explanations. When you have a declining share of manufacturing, it's most likely you will suffer from deceleration growth of the productivity. This is what I personally think a trend that is worrying. Now again, one can always make an argument, well, look at the trend since 1990s. Yes, the growth of productivity declined after the crisis in 1997, but look what happened, it recovers. Same argument can be put up now. Yes, global financial crisis 2008 led to the decline in the growth of the productivity, but don't worry, it will recover. I have a second thought about that argument. Yes, of course, anything that falls will go up. Yes, I buy that. But how long that will take and at what cost? This is what worries me, because the whole process of adjustment for recovery, I don't know when, it will be very painful. So in other words, yes, I understand there are multiple issues faced by Indonesian economy at this moment, from balance of payment, current account, inflation, name it. But underlying all this, I think we should worry more about this fundamental medium and long-term trend, which is worrying, and that is the decelerations of the growth of productivity. As I mentioned earlier, you will hear more from Ross, how the trend in outside the countries, particularly in China, that led to the big demand for natural resource products, including from Indonesia, led to the development that we have observed since 2000, more particularly since 2003, because the double-digit growth rate in China started after 2003, and then everything reversed after 2011. So I hope my worrying trend here put it this way, I hope I'm wrong in terms of making my speculation that things will take a long time. But in the context of Sadli lecture, as I indicated earlier, Pak Sadli is someone whom I admire. I regret that I haven't seen Sadli here, but Pak Sadli is one of my heroes because I learned a lot from him, and I'm pretty sure many of us around the room is also his students in one way or another. I never been in his class, but as I indicated earlier, every time I have the discussion with him, I always learn something new. So to LPM and to the Australian National University, I thank both of you for inviting me in this important lesson, and I hope we can have fruitful discussions after we hear the presentation from Ross. Thank you very much.